Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Ratcliffe, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, did you make the decision not to recommend criminal charges relating to classified information before or after Hillary Clinton was interviewed by the FBI on July the 2nd?
After.
So right there you can see in the video James Comey clearly states that he waited until after he interviewed Hillary Clinton and 17 other witnesses to recommend no prosecution be charged against her. So Chuck Grassley and the Senate Judiciary Committee has been investigating this, and they've gotten themselves a hold of some of the Comey memos, Comey drafts, and Comey statements that he wrote while he was at the FBI. And one of them concerned them, and it was particularly about the Clinton email investigation. Now this is what they said. Both transcripts are heavily redacted without explanation. However, they indicate that Comey began drafting a statement to announce the conclusion of the Clinton email investigation in April or May of 2016. Before the FBI interviewed up to 17 key witnesses, including former Secretary Clinton and several of her closest aides. The draft statement also came before the department entered into immunity agreements with Cheryl Mills and Heather Samuelson, where the department agreed to a very limited review of Secretary Clinton's emails and destroy their laptops after review. In an extraordinary July announcement, Comey exonerated Clinton despite noting there is evidence of potential violations of the statutes regarding the handling of classified information. So Chuck Grassley and the Senate Judiciary Committee are now asking the new FBI director for more information, because if it's true that Comey was going to exonerate Hillary Clinton, then he lied under oath multiple times, and I'm going to show you that clip again so you guys can hear it again and see it. But he clearly states, James Comey, that he did not recommend prosecution for Hillary Clinton and all of her other 17 people involved in this until after he witnessed them. But this statement that they just found in the Senate Judiciary Committee contradicts that, and it says that in April or May of 2016, James Comey actually already concluded that he was not going to prosecute or recommend prosecution for her. So thanks for watching. I'm going to show you the video now.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Ratcliffe, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, did you make the decision not to recommend criminal charges relating to classified information before or after Hillary Clinton was interviewed by the FBI on July the 2nd?
After.
Okay, then I'm going to need your help in trying to understand how that's possible. I think there's a lot of prosecutors or former prosecutors that are shaking our heads in how that could be the case, because if there was ever any real possibility that Hillary Clinton might be charged for something that she admitted to on July the 2nd, why would two of the central witnesses in a potential prosecution against her be allowed to sit in the same room to hear the testimony? Now, I've heard your earlier answers today. You said that, well, it was because the interview was voluntary and they were her lawyers. But I think you're skirting the real issue there, Director. First of all, the fact that it was voluntary, it didn't have to be, right? You could have impaneled an investigative grand jury. She could have been subpoenaed. And I know you've said that you can't comment on that, and I don't really care about the decision about whether or not there should have been a grand jury here. But since you didn't have one, it goes to the issue at hand about whether or not this interview should have ever taken place. With due respect to the answers that you've given, the FBI and the Department of Justice absolutely control whether or not an interview is going to take place with other witnesses in the room, because the simple truth is, if under the circumstances as you've described, those interviews never take place. If there was ever any possibility that something Hillary Clinton might have said on July 2nd could have possibly resulted in criminal charges that might possibly resulted in a trial against her relating to this classified information, well then, to use your words, Director, I don't think that there's any reasonable prosecutor out there who would have allowed two immunized witnesses central to the prosecution to proving the case against her to sit in the room with the interview, the FBI interview of the subject of that investigation. And if I heard you earlier today, in your long career, I heard you say that you've never had that circumstance. Did I hear you correctly?
That's correct. But
okay, and I never have either, and I've never met a prosecutor that's ever had that. So, to me, the only way that an interview takes place with the two central witnesses and the subject of the investigation is if the decision has already been made that all three people in that room are not going to be charged.
Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Downing, how long have you been at the Department of Justice?
Coming up on 18 years.
I think that we ought to have some
think that we ought to have, we could stimulate some useful activity on the part of the administration to get something positive done here. And I thank you.
I'll be
yielding
happy
back
to
the
join with the
focus.
lady in that, gentlelady in that. We now go to the gentleman from Ohio who's been patiently waiting, Mr. Jordan.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Downing, how long have you been at the Department of Justice?
Coming up on 18 years.
Okay, 18 years. We appreciate your service. A week ago, Mr. Comey, former FBI Director Mr. Comey, testified that then Attorney General Loretta Lynch told him to, when he discussed the Clinton investigation, to call it a matter, not an investigation. You recall that testimony from Mr. Comey?
I have heard news reports of that.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Were you part of the discussion and decision at the Justice Department to instruct the FBI Director not to call an investigation an investigation?
No, sir. I'm a career employee of the Justice Department, and I was not involved in any of that level of.
Do you agree with that decision that was made and, frankly, implemented by the FBI Director?
I'm afraid, sir, I don't have an opinion one way or the other on that.
Do you know if that's ever happened before, where the Attorney General tells the FBI Director to portray something differently than what is actually happening, and i.e. not to call an investigation an investigation?
I'm afraid I have no information for you on that.
Were you part of any decision by the Justice Department to allow the perception to continue that President Trump was under investigation when, in fact, he wasn't and was told 3 times by the FBI Director that he wasn't?
I'm trying to make clear I am not involved in decisions at that level, and I have no information about it.
Do you think it's wise for the Justice Department to mislead the American people?
Of course, the Justice Department should do its best not to mislead anyone.
And you would agree that in both situations the American people were misled?
I have no basis to answer that question.
Well, think about it. In one situation, it was an investigation, and the FBI Director was instructed to call it something different, to call it a matter. In the other situation, the President of the United States was not under investigation, and yet that would not be confirmed, not be stated, and the perception was allowed to exist that, in fact, he was. Twice the American people were misled by the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That's probably not a good thing, is it?
I have no opinion for you on that.
I mean, but, you know, you've served 18 years at the Justice Department. You went to Stanford Law School. You're a smart guy, a good lawyer. Is that normally how it operates at the Department of Justice? And, well, let me ask this. Do you know of any other occasion where the Attorney General has instructed someone with an important job like running the FBI to mislead the American people?
I have no basis to believe that, no.
You don't think it's ever happened before? You don't know of any other time it's happened?
I don't have any opinion on that, no.
What about the leak? What about the idea that the head of the FBI decides to give information to a friend who's then going to pass it to the New York Times? Should that be something that actually takes place, even though at the time he was a former FBI director? Is that appropriate for someone who's held that position to engage in that kind of activity?
I'm afraid I also don't have an opinion on that.
But as someone who's worked at the Department of Justice for 18 years, Stanford law degree, you think that's the appropriate kind of conduct for someone who has served in the Justice Department, particularly at a high, not even as high level as you, but someone who's been head of the FBI?
I think I could say that the FBI is a higher level than me. The FBI director is a higher level than me. No, I'm sorry, sir. I don't have an opinion about these kinds of questions. I understand the motivation and the need to try to get to answers on these questions, but I'm not the right person to be in a position to answer them for you, sir.
I appreciate you trying to respond, Mr. Downing. But what I also think the American people would appreciate is the highest officials at the Department of Justice should be straight with the American people. And that did not happen. No ifs, ands, buts about it. Did not happen. And they were misled at the direction of the Attorney General. Mr. Comey's testimony was real clear. He even questioned, he said, do we really want to do that? Don't we want to tell the American people the truth? And yet he carried out the order from the Attorney General to mislead the American people and say it was a matter, not an investigation. And of course, as I've said a couple times, he allowed the perception to continue that our current President of the United States was under investigation when in fact he was not. And with that, Mr. Chairman,
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield to the chairman.
Mr. Downing, I understand you can't always speak about things that aren't your main wheelhouse, if you will. Have you ever spoken to the press off the record, provided any information about an ongoing case to a press person?
I've certainly spoken to the press off the record, sir. Of course, we are very careful about what we disclose, and we try to do our best to stay within the lines, certainly at my level.
Okay, so I'll take that as a yes. Thank you. We now go to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee.
Let me welcome both Mr. Downing and Mr. McGinnis and